of Arquivo Contemporâneo, a contemporary archive, published in 2009, which is a collection of interviews with several contemporary artists from Brazil. And his recent curatorial projects include Ligia Clark, a retrospective, which he curated with Paulo Sérgio Duarte in São Paulo at a very important cultural space called Itaú Cultural. Abram Palatnik at the Museum of Modern Art in São Paulo in 2015. And Franz Weissmann, The Emptiness as Form, again at Itaú Cultural, and several other locations, if I'm not mistaken, in São Paulo in 2019. Felipe is also a very old friend. He was initially, I think he was the first UAL associate PhD student. When a student is enrolled overseas in a PhD program, but comes over to UAL and TrAIN specifically in this case, to do part of their research in the UK. So without further ado, I've noticed that Felipe has uploaded his presentation. So I'll pass it over to Felipe, and but before I do so, just a quick note on the format of today. Felipe will speak for approximately half an hour, and then he will have a conversation with me for about the same time, maybe less, and then we will open for questions, so that hopefully there's lots of time for you to ask questions and so on. But feel free to put your questions as they come along in the chat box, and or otherwise wait until the end to put your question yourself. But we'll be happy to read questions if you so prefer. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Felipe. Welcome, Felipe.
Thank you, Michael, for your kind words. Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, to have the opportunity to share my research. It's a brand new research. I have arrived here in London in March, the first week of March. And I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you. Let me see, just a moment, please. I think everyone is seeing the PowerPoint. The title of my research is named as People on Stage. As Michael said, my focus is on Hélio Oiticica and Lina Bo Bardi works around early 60s, early 60s, from early 60s to late 60s. Um, and as I told you, it's a brand new research I have started this year. I received a grant from the Brazilian Ministry of Culture, so that's the reason I'm here in London. And the first step of my research in London was investigated, the Guy Brett's archive and seeing what Guy wrote on Hélio Oiticica and the Latin American art in general in 60s and 70s. So that's my focus in London, to write and research the Guy Brett's archive as well. So let's start. My present research looks at how the work of Lina Bo Bardi and Hélio Oiticica problematized the representation of the so-called the common people during the 1960s, of course, in Brazil. In other words, I'm interested in how the architect Lina Bo Bardi and the artist Hélio Oiticica, two key figures within the formation of contemporaneity in Brazil, dealt with the established cultural hierarchies which the marginalized classes have been submitted to in the country, both socially and through the art production. In this sense, I cast light on how Oiticica displayed and debate the body of the black people from the favela, and in Bobardi's case, how she showed and reflect on the body within the cultures from Brazil's northeast. But touching on the concept of the performativity in the title of the research, I posed the idea that although Oiticica did not personally create the documentary records of his own works, he nevertheless did provide direction or editorial guidance for those photos. By directing the camera at the body of the residents of the Mangueira favela, re-recorded not only the artwork but also inscribed the contexts, the environment, and the bodies that framed his work. The conjunction of displaced the work not only at the fringe of the museum but also on the margins of the country as a social project. In this sense, what interested me here is not so much the participative character of Hélio Oiticica's work or the degree to which they were experimental, but rather the way in which the artist documented them. In Bobardi's case, the idea of the stage or scenario arises from her exhibition displays. This device that she designed, let me see an image here. This device that she designed and the way in which she then presented Brazilian popular cultures within museological context has scarcely been reflected upon in terms of representation of the people as they are transformed into artifacts, whose presence in shows or as objects in collections are perhaps too quickly applauded as radical gestures. Representations of the favela, representations of the favela had been a recurrent theme in the Brazilian visual arts from its inception. Modernist artists such as Di Cavalcante, Cândido Portinari, and Lazar Segal, among others, referred to the favela as a recurrent theme in their paintings. In the first years of the 20th century, there was a wish within Brazilian visual arts to configure and convey a national identity, and that that may be understood as progressive considering the preceding centuries of slavery and colonization. For artists on the left, the idea of identity was to transpose the bourgeois fashion of portraits and idyllic landscapes, switching their focus instead towards the people, a category that ranged from horror works to the marginalized mestizo, black, indigenous populations. However, it was the generations of Oiticica Ligia Papa in late 50s, early 60s, and later that of Antonio Manuel in early 70s, who established a closer, more personal relationship with the residents of the favela in Rio de Janeiro. These artists assumed a social commitment, not only in the making of artworks with a more direct political agency, but especially experienced the favela firsthand, showing and debating the social political space as one that had been neglected by the state and romanticized by culture. The exhibitions organized by Lina Bo Bardi in late 50s, early 60s involved what I'm calling the presence of a body which carried unmistakably northeast identity. There is, in this sense, a focus in my research on space within the favela and beyond. The state of Bahia locate both metaphorically and physically far away from the metropolitan centers of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. I should also remind that the historical period concerned here was that when Brazil was under a military dictatorship, when repression was inflicted even more harshly on the poor population that had already been victimized by high rates of infant mortality and unemployment. In this sense, it's important to emphasize the risk of the discourse falling into the exorcisation of these bodies and place. There are two positions that have emerged with the discourse on this period, which with its own distinct narrative, that of the producer and the subject. While the former, the artist, take a stand with the political plane in his associative progress action, he or she produce a reflection that reinforce the authority already attributed to the subject, the poor, predominantly black bodies. In this sense, the established colonial power relations are hardly disconstructed, since there is still an affirmation of that bourgeois, Euro, and ethnocentric place that privileges the producer of the art object and the discourse that is formed around such work. There is, to paraphrase Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks, the clear danger of the colonized being treated as a thing by the colonizer, whether as object of desire or of abjection. Oiticica and Bo Bardi themselves took up a pseudo-ethnographic discourse, roughly speaking, of the favela in the northeastern. They talk about displays, cultures, identities, and race for their own perspective. In a certain way, they ambiguously continue to hide the voices of their subjects, focusing on their bodies. If when if with Oiticica this is explicit, in the case of Bobard's exhibitions, I would say the subject's body is present as a trace, a spectre, like a phantom or something like that. The voices of the people from the favela and of the cultures in Brazil's interior, particularly the ones from the northeast and north, remain those of the subaltern, a black resident of the Mangueira favela who wears a cape made by artist Hélio Oiticica does not own the object he or she is wearing. Likewise, northeastern person is seen between quotes, but not heard in Bobard's exhibition. The word or the discourse are not granted to those who are the subjects of these artists. It is at this threshold that the case studies in my research, whether exhibitions or artworks, approach the subject of the common people in Brazilian art. One, I would argue, that is still based on that bourgeois perspective, which the modernists already tried and failed to overthrow. The research does not intend to aggrandize any artist, rather, it aims to present the contradictions of these artistic proposals. For instance, in the case of the photographic documentations of Oiticica's work, beyond the showing of the space of the favela as a symbol of invention in face of adversities, would there the space for the punctum of a political sun is a question mark. That is, their photos posed as questions about social needs in Brazil, another question mark. Questions like this are what guide my thought about the danger of a romantic accent regarding this imagery of the favela. As pointed out by Asbury, opening quotes, the friendship between Oiticica and the residents of Mangueira, despite being a bridge all over the alterity that exists between the other and the self, is always a precarious condition, close quotes. Oiticica's work seems to run along this thin line. We cannot forget that favela is also seen as a space of originality in its day-to-day life. That is, despite or because of this precarity, the favela is considered admirable for its ability to cope with challenges in creative ways. If, on the one hand, it's seen as a dangerous space in the city, with an ample presence of criminality and shade people, and the other, the favela is the place that bears meanings of purity and essentiality. Since its beginning, the favela has occupied a prominent place in the mindset of intellectuals and artists. The Italian futurist poet Filippo Marinetti in 1926 visits the favela of Morro da Providência in Rio de Janeiro, and he was reported to have been to have astonishment at how happy, between quotes, happy and carefree the life of those residents were. Still concerning the discovery of the favela, Carlos Basualdo's critique on Hélio Oiticica has an interesting slant. An interesting slant. When writing his celebrated texts about the exhibition Nova Objetividade Brasileira in 1967, Oiticica states that the ideas about a collective art derived, opening quotes for Oiticica, from the discovery of organized popular manifestations, some schools, parties of all kinds, football, street markets, and the spontaneous or random events, art in the streets, closing quotes, and now opening quotes for Basualdo's critique. These statements deserve our careful attention. Who discovered the Samba schools? The answer is just one. For a elitist tradition like that of the visual arts, founded on the modern notion of autonomy, any approximation to popular art would acquire the meaning of a cultural expedition in rapid expansion, as happened in Brazil at that time, closing quotes. That time is late 60s. Uh, these questions also apply as much to Lina Bo Bardi when the popular markets of Bahia she visits in 1960s because she was a professor there in Salvador, Bahia, served as a reference for the designs of her exhibitions. But did those exhibitions involve a symbolic representation of the actual environment in all its precarity? It's another question mark. Around 1967, at the height of the political repression in Brazil, Oiticica presented what he understood as participant art, an expression taken from a perspective of the Brazilian art critic Ferreira Goulart, who at that moment was immersed in the debate of culture as a way of raising in the awareness of the masses about the idea of being engaged artists at that specific moment. This context is fundamental to understand a new position that some artists, critics, and curators, in the later case in particular Bo Bardi, adopt against the backdrop of the first years of Brazil's dictatorship. In this respect, I call attention to the situation where there's one part of society with no possibility of having its image project or problematized through artistic works. The works and exhibitions by Oiticica and Lina Bo Bardi infiltrated the museum through a process of clashing, and as a political action, they revealed an, an image of the people, more especially the image of black people, poor people, northeastern women and children. Oiticica and Bo Bardi wanted to break that status quo and afterwards spread different perspectives about cultural identity in Brazil. Their focus on the excluded people, on an idea of formatting subaltern voices and bodies. It's clear that this configuration is not easily discernible. It has a complex structure. The idea of the popular, in the sense of showing the more socially fragile layers, which is part and parcel of the proposition of both artists, wound up also turning against them, perhaps more strongly in Bo Bardi's case, since alongside her husband, Pietro Maria Bardi, she was at the helm of the largest art museum in Latin America. I'm saying about MASP, the Museum of Art of São Paulo, based in São Paulo. I would say that the idea of national identity, or to put it better, of the construction of identities in the field of culture, is profoundly linked to a reinterpretation of the popular, one that is established by economic elite. When Bo Bardi held the exhibition A Mão do Povo Brasileiro at MASP, at Museum of Modern Art in São Paulo in 1969, she was also stating that
That
this culture did not exist, at least as far as the scholars of the metropolis were concerned. The exhibition presents a vast overview of Brazil's rich material culture, around 1,000 objects, including ex-votos, fabrics, furniture, tools, animal cages, machines, musical instruments, decorations, toys, religious objects, and other household objects, produced from the end of the 19th century until the late 1960s, collect especially in the country's north and northeast regions. It's important to underscore that the 1950s in Brazil represented the institutionalization of the modern art in Brazil through the creation of the museums and of the Bienal de São Paulo, the São Paulo Biennial. The 1960s saw the intensification of the debate between figuration and abstraction, and it was this context that gave rise to Lina's discussions and exhibitions involving the debate about art and handcraft, low and high culture. There was, in Brazilian art, a desire for experimentation and expansion of the frontiers about what art should be. This was also the time that gave rise to the performance and proposals of Ligia Clark, Ligia Pap, and Hélio Oiticica. In the case of Lina's exhibition, the fact that those objects were being shown in an art museum with the highest quality collection of international modern art in Brazil brought, at least, a proposal to penetrate this bourgeois membrane. The collection, the Maspi collection, has, for instance, a large collection of impressionist painters like Monet, Renoir, as well as Van Gogh, Cézanne. So it's a very important art museum in Latin America. Moreover, the objects were shown without the presence of walls, elevate only slightly on low wooden platforms or displayed on stands of the same material. They were in range of the visitor's close-up view and touch. In this scenario, there were no frames, acrylic box, or any other sort of barrier to looking at the objects. The strategy was clear. Bo Bardi was approximating the exhibition's goers to the street markets. On the other hand, Nestor Garcia Conclini, the Argentine thinker, critiqued museum space that did not respect the place and history of the objects that are being shown. Despite contributing towards the conception of a beauty above geographic and cultural difference, they also giving rise to uniformity that hides the social contradictions present in the origin of these works. It seems that the palms were not used for cooking, and he adds, the fascination of beholding beauty annuls the fear of standing before the difference, closing quotes for Garcia Campini. Oiticica was kicked out of his own exhibition in 1965 during the opening of the avant-garde show Opinião 65, held at the Museum of Modern Art of Rio de Janeiro. The artists and the residents from Mangueira, wearing the artist parangolas, were prevented from remaining in the museum's exhibition space. I speculate that the reasons for this could have varied between the dancing and the ship materials being qualified as art. The music, in a contagious enthusiasm in opposition to the austere environment of a museum, and especially having a group of black residents of the Mangueira favela inside a social and cultural space largely visited by the wealth classes. This episode, however, creates a terrain for considering what Oiticica had already been saying, and which he wrote about 2 years later in the text named as Esquema Geral da Nova Objetividade, opening quotes to Oiticica. The phenomenon of the avant-garde in Brazil is not longer a question of a group coming from an isolated elite, but rather a broad cultural question of great scope. The artist must be a social being, a creator not only of artworks, but also a modifier of consciousness. Closing quotes. For Oiticica, this modification constitutes another fundamental turning point in his work. From 1964 onwards, he began to frequent the Morro da Mangueira favela. That was the place where a gay, drug-using, and highly inventive artist could move about and behave without being the victim of the oppressions by a conservative society with little tolerance for Oiticica's patterns. That atmosphere of intense social exchange is reflected in the photograph documentations of the Parangolés embologies. The protagonists in those records are the artist's friends, residents of Mangueira. The photos provide signs for identifying the place, context, and origin to which that works belong. They are they provide people intrinsically linked to the carnival. These choices, which I imagine are not by chance, create new forms of understand the broadly social character of Oiticica's work. The idea of participation, which is often mentioned in connection with his work, is not only participation for the sake of participation, but especially the inclusion of marginalized social groups that begin to be seen and replicated through the artist's publications or performative propositions. As I see it, the artist's desire, and to a certain degree his strategy, was to promote the circulation of images or representations of a marginalized social class that was also marginalized by the supposedly democratic system. These images convey not only the artwork in the strict sense, but also the person who wears, handles, or uses it. To state this better, the artwork is the entire set of these factors, both the body and the parangolé with their respective formal and phenomenological qualities, but also the cultural and social representations they evoke. When the work is documented, Oiticica leaves the scene, and who appears is the people, their identity and reality. It's interesting to think that the photographic documentation is also a work by the artist. I would like to discuss in more detail the exhibition A Mão do Povo Brasileiro, a case study for this research. Let's see. Um, it's interesting to think about the relationship within the context of an exhibition which Lina forged between art and artifact. In the operations of clashing and juxtaposition between these two categories, Bo Bardi crossed a trick terrain, one that's very difficult yet nevertheless necessary to discern, because while on the one hand she posed two the two denominations as equals, on the other she fell into the trap of elevating the artifact to the status of art. I do not think she attempted this supposed elevation due to a colonialist stance, but rather, I repeat, it was because this is a territory where it's difficult to have an assertive position, even when the constructor of these narratives has every intention to remain within a discussion limited to the terrain of culture or based on static criteria or political positions. This sort of operation always includes the risk that the object of popular culture will be fetishized or seen as a relic in the sense of being appreciated as something picturesque. Tício Escobar, um, Tício Escobar is a art critic from Paraguay, argues that popular culture is marked by opposition with hegemonic power, but this negotiation ends up by placing the former into an unfavorable position in the social scene, preventing access to the various instances of power. Like Jesus wrote, opening quotes, the concept of popular culture denotes a specific place marked by tensions, contradictions, blank space, and ruptures. In comparison with that of culture, the concept of popular art can be useful for not denoting an essence, but a position in which alternative means are at play along with proposals contrary to the reasonings of the center, closing quotes for Jesus Escobar. Poverty and its everyday objects in A Mão do Povo Brasileiro appear as part of an alternative project in relation to alienating industrialization in the underdeveloped country as Brazil. I also recall that in 1960 there was the publication Quarto de Despejo, Diário de uma Favelada, by Carolina Maria de Jesus, a seminal book that reproduced the diary of De Jesus, a resident of the poor communities of São Paulo, describing the tough reality of her daily life. Harder than someone from the outside writing about the favela and its residents. In her case, we have poverty problematized by the person who actually lives it. One question, however, because our consideration. Who saw these images and exhibitions by Bo Bardi at MASP? I would say that the question is echoing in the art museums today because of a series of economic, cultural, psychological, social, and racial factors. The museum, and even more so in the 1960s in Brazil, is an elitist place. Bobard was aware of this question, especially since she was herself a member of the elite, but I think that the relevant point of her projects was precisely to cause a rupture to give rise to new interpretations and possibilities for the museum and on a large scale for the reflection and consumption of culture in the country. Nevertheless, even though her exhibitions had an ideological progressivist thrust, they always continued to be producing in a hierarchizing view of culture and political social positions in the country. As a journalist wrote in 1969, at the inauguration of MASP's building, there was a massive presence of the elite of São Paulo in a night of gala, that class that lived from the exploitation of the works of the hands of thousands of Brazilians paraded curiously around the museum's piece, as described by Muniz, this journalist in 1969. Moreover, the works featured in Amão do Povo Brasileiro were not attributed any authorship. This gesture, however, points to another one. Conceiving and individualizing the face is a strategy of power and affirmation of one field, arts, over another, handcrafted. The artisan continues as a subject. Let me see the image. The artisan continues as a subject who is not attributed identifiable whole in history. This difference is accentuated in the field of cultural and economic hierarchies, giving rise to the distinction between intellectual work and manual work, revealing the artist as a bourgeois entrepreneur in the static field, while the artisan belongs to the people, a skillful one relegated to routine work. The artisan is linked to a collective and communitarian practice marked by repetition, while the artist, at the opposite pole, is marked by a creative, individual, designer, innovative work. In short, the exhibition points to a cultural richness that was not illustrated or present in the museums, even while, on the other hand, it's maintained in a latent state the cultural difference between artist and artisan, or more fundamentally between poor and rich, metropolis and hinterland, academic and unschooled, erudite and popular. I'm finishing. As a point of contact with Bobardi, it's interesting to perceive how Oiticica problematized the museological space, bringing the metaphor of the favela. The setup of the installation Tropicalia in the show Nova Objetividade Brasileira at the Museum of Modern Art of Rio de Janeiro in 1967 evidence of favela architecture imposing itself in a space of high culture. Soil, rubble, and plants take over the space of the museum. Pieces of wood helping to hold up fragile fabrics that create divisions as well as rooms. Hélio Oiticica was also interested, above all, in reflecting on who use and produce a definitively public art. To me, this clashing proposed by the artist seems clear. Tropicalia, therefore, is not only the metaphorized setup of a favela in a museum, but a response to the question of the dimension and the borders of the understanding of public space to whom the museum belonged, and which bodies and cultures were shown in that space. In a country experiencing the collapse of democracy, Oiticica phrased the borders between center, exemplified by a petit bourgeois perspective of the Brazilian museological institutions, and periphery, even though mediated by bourgeois artists desiring to become part of a public commitment for representation in a wide range of spheres. So that's it, people. That's it. That's to finish here.
Thank you very much, Felipe. Um, Thanks for such a provocative presentation. I'll let you catch your breath a bit now. Uh, have you've taken off your presentation, right? So maybe you
Yes.
can come back on camera.
Okay. Are you seeing me?
Yes. So I expect you can see people can see both of us now. So yeah, a very provocative presentation. Uh, Raising kind of issues that seem to have been for a long time kind of brushed under the kind of carpet, the metaphorical carpet, for since the beginning. Well, I don't know since when it started, but it seems that the entire kind of canon of Brazilian art has kind of until recently assumed or confused the issue of agency and representation rather a lot. So I think the time is right to ask these questions relating or trying to separate issues of representation, representation of the kind of the popular, the so-called common man or
People.
common person, yeah, and their own kind of agency and their capacity for kind of representing themselves, basically. Um, I think you mentioned, you quoted me, which I'm very grateful for, honored, but I don't really know from which text, but I was thinking of a text I wrote a long time ago about this relation between Oiticica and the people of the favela, and how it's a kind of a very unequal relationship, and how that hasn't really been problematized within his work, neither in Brazil, and it seems, or I don't know if it has been elsewhere. But so speaking, kind of bringing the kind of a transnational kind of perspective, or the kind of I guess you're speaking more from within a national canon. So within the kind of construction of Brazilian, how modern and contemporary art in Brazil is understood. But I'd like to kind of start by going focusing on Lina Bo Bardi's exhibition, A Mão do Povo Brasileiro, from 1969. And given your points about the problematic staging of that exhibition in 1969, I wonder, I was kind of ambivalent whether those um, the photographs you've showed were from the original exhibition. Okay,
Yes.
yeah, because it's been restaged. So my question, it was staged in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, at MASPI as well, which is interesting.
16. Yeah.
Was it
Is,
16?
I think so.
Anyway, it's really within the last
Anyway.
5 years, yeah.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering, given that you are problematizing the original exhibition in 1969, when all these issues of relating to popular culture, I mean, this was a moment in which pop art was emerging as the main kind of international kind of tendency, and it's interesting maybe to draw upon maybe later on Mario Pedrosa's kind of writing about pop art and Brazilian popular culture. But anyway. Um, Given that those issues were very much of that time, what's your opinion of of that exhibition being restaged in today's context? What do you think is gained? What do you think is um, what is the purpose other than a kind of exhibition history kind of interest?
Mhm. But, well, thanks for your question. I think the positive point was the possibility of bringing the debate about the decolonial with more force in art field in Brazil. If the exhibition was held in Maspin, if I'm right, in 2006, 5 years ago, and
16.
16.
16.
Sorry, 2016. This exhibition was one of the first that must be organized after this so-called decolonial turn came out into existence in the museum's schedule, in the museum's programming, you know. But I think the major problem, the major issue was that it celebrates Lina's choice as almost how can I say a flawless action. And and my talk was exactly to raise her contradictions, the way how she show up, the objects, the artifacts, or or artworks made the northeastern people from Brazil, but at the same time, as I said, there is no any kind of authorship. When you read the labels in 1969, you didn't see the authorship, the year, who produced that artifact or art object. So this contradiction um, called my attention to the way how Lina showed up all the objects. So I like to. I saw the exhibition in 2016, and I got surprised because the catalog was very how can I say they said, oh, Lina was brilliant in 1969. There is no passage informing Lina was married to Pietro Maria Bardi. She was a front leader of the museum. It was pretty hard to think about that.
I think it's important to mention, however, that like I mean I take your point about this kind of over glorifying the figure,
Yes, yes.
but I think something that you didn't mention is that Lina Bo Bardi did live for many years in. Oh, maybe you did mention it that in Bahia, in Salvador.
Salvador.
Yeah,
She was a
uh,
professor there.
yeah, you did mention. Sorry, but so that she, like Oiticica, she was kind of an outsider, but who had a kind of first-hand kind of contact with popular, so-called popular sectors of society, and was interested in maybe as a kind of an anthropological and over anthropological or ethnological kind of gaze,
Hmm.
but was nevertheless interested in the culture and the kind of uh, the ways of life, etc. That for the time could be seen as quite progressive in a way. No,
Definitely, definitely. I agree with you. But they built different ways on how they look at the common people or people. I don't know.
so,
Because
Sorry, Felipe, you just froze for a bit. So if you could just repeat what you said.
Okay. No, I said, they look at to the common people in different ways. First of all, as I said, Lina was she was not the director of the museum. She's not the curator, but she acted like the director and the curator
Mm.
at MASPI. So she had a power, she had a kind of power to choose who will participate in the exhibitions or not. And Oiticica, the way how Hélio arrived in Mangueira in 1964 um, is completely it's completely different from how Lina approached the northeastern culture,
Mm.
because there is a sense of hierarchizing, mechanism, and in how Lina did or fought her exhibitions.
Do you think that today there is a sense of emphasizing Lina Bo Bardi over and above her husband Pietro Bo Bardi because maybe of his kind of questionable, to say the least, political associations while he was still in Italy during the war?
I think so. I think so. In fact, it's pretty hard to read some research on Pietro Maria Bardi. It will be a case of study very interesting to research. The way how Pietro Maria Bardi direct, the MASPI on in the first years of that museum. He died. I don't know if he was 90 years old, something like that. He was pretty old, and he was the head of the MASPI until early 80s, if I'm right.
Mm.
Uh, and but I would like to say one more thing about MASPI, concerning your first question. But because I think the Brazilian museums are still very in depth to modernist art, and must be claimed in 2015, 2016, claimed the colonial place, and this power is also measured by the financial contribution that the museum has had since 2015, 2016.
Mm.
We'll talk about the exhibitions like Amor do Povo Brasileiro, the restage, but also catalogs, seminars, seminar works borrowed from international museums like MoMA and Tate. And I think, the curious thing is that much of this money comes from very rich Brazilian banks and companies. I'm saying about, the sponsorship. And I'm thinking what decolonial represents what the colony represents. It's a kind of brand that these companies and banks want to have for themselves. So it's very dangerous to think, the link between the museum and the decolonial think, and how this agency involving banks and companies are articulated.
I, I I agree, but that isn't that the case for most museums and such institutions around the world. And on the other hand, hasn't MASPI was in complete decline and until 2015 when Adriano Pedrosa took over. And don't you think that that was a moment, a kind of an overdue moment in which a museum in Brazil began to address such issues, whether it was funded from banks or whatever,
Mhm.
independent of the funding? Don't you think, as a mode of address, wasn't that something that was embarrassingly overdue in Brazil?
Yeah, definitely. It's a issue. it's pretty hard to think about that because we are living in Brazil, tough government. There is no more Brazilian Minister of Culture since Bolsonaro emerged as president. So it's pretty hard to the museums maintain their functions in Brazil. So
Hmm. Well, look, I'm concerned about time, so let's
okay,
move
okay,
on
okay, okay.
quickly to Oiticica before I open up for
All right,
questions.
all right, all right. Let's
Um,
go.
and on Oiticica, therefore, and I think the two kind of case studies are so different from each other that I think we have to approach them separately. I mean, there is a kind of a zeitgeist, etc., of the
Mhm,
'60s that you could kind of bring them together. But as practitioners, an architect, an exhibition organizer, etc., and an artist, they are quite, and also one based in São Paulo, another in Rio, etc.
mhm,
Their their differences are kind of stronger than their similarities in terms of their approach. So I think it's normal to approach questions individually. Um, so on Oiticica, it's worth also remembering on this theme um, the occasion when Guy Brett, in the exhibition catalogue for Oiticica in London, which was an exhibition of 2007, I think, at Tate Modern.
I think so.
Yeah, Guy Brett, he mentions that um, in the exhibition catalogue of Oiticica's Whitechapel exhibition of 1969, so we're
Mhm,
talking about two exhibitions of the same year, Lina Bo Bardi's in São Paulo, the hand of the Brazilian people, and Oiticica's exhibition in London at the Whitechapel in 1969. So Guy Brett remembers that the art critic Mário Pedrosa, who saw the exhibition and also canvassed on behalf of the artist for the exhibition actually to take place at the Whitechapel. Um, Guy Brett remembers Pedrosa being very critical of the way in which the people from Mangueira were represented in that catalogue.
mm.
In the in the pictures, which kind of because there were also it was a black and white catalogue. I don't think there were many colored publications
At that time.
at that time. Um, because of all the pictures are black and white, there is a kind of timelessness about them. So the contemporaneous pictures of Oiticica and his friends in Magueira become almost kind of connected to other kind of more kind of ethnographic
Mhm.
even archaeological maybe pictures
Perspective. Yeah.
that were included in the catalogue as a kind of I don't know why, but a guy said that he included because he was interested in architecture without architects and other kind of anthropological. So there are pictures of so-called primitive tribes
Mhm.
next to
The, the,
next
there
to
was the exhibition at MoMA 1 year before, I think.
really primitivism and cubism.
Yes. Yes.
Cubism was it 68? I can't remember. But anyway, there was this kind of association between the culture of the favela and so-called primitive tribes, which is very. I think this was what Mario Pedrosa was getting at.
Mhm.
This kind of very ethnocentric view that the catalog kind of transpose, and very little people talk about it, even though that guy, with incredible kind of honesty, basically reflects on a mistake that he himself did as the editor of the catalog. Um, so I wonder. Um, I lost my track a bit, but yeah. So I wonder if you could if I mean this is a little bit outside. It's not really fair, but I wonder if you have comments on
Mhm.
Mario Pedrosa's approach to pop art, to the popular, to Brazilian popular, and perhaps since we're talking about museums, perhaps you could speak a little bit about your thoughts on Pedrosa's own project
Mm-hmm.
for the Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro, which in 1978 caught fire, and Pedrosa proposed this new museum, a
Mm-hmm.
museum of the origins, looking at the original peoples of Brazil, the so-called I mean, the original peoples of Brazil are the there are only there are many different peoples originals, but they don't include neither the Europeans nor the Afro-Brazilians who were brought to
The
Brazil by the
indigenous as well. Mm-hmm.
yeah, yeah. I'm talking about the origins or the indigenous, but for Mário Pedrosa, thinking of very much along the lines of Gilberto Freire and the formation of the Brazilian people for the three kind of groups, the indigenous, the Europeans, and the Africans. He suggested a museum that looks at those origins as well as modern art. So what do you think of that project as a
Mm-hmm.
kind of a parallel to Bobardi's exhibition?
Mm-hmm. So, well, we have two questions here. Fair enough. I think first of all, I think the exhibition at Whitechapel in London, 1969. I'm talking about the Hélio show, was his first and last solo exhibition, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah,
It was an exhibition that had an experimental character, and today the catalog probably probably would suffer a lot of criticism. But we have to analyze as art historians the artwork in light of their time. So it's very important to keep this idea on my mind, on our mind. Oiticica, I think he wanted to celebrate the place and his friends and the friends he made in Mangueira, no? Because he discovered the Mangueira in 1964, and the exhibition here in London was in 1969. So it was a very close time. So it was a catalog that showed Mangueira as it was, no, without makeup. No, there were images of celebrations of how can I say Afro Brazilian religions, samba schools, but also of the poverty that was the place. No, I think that's the main idea, mixing the richness of Mangueira, connect to the image of the Afro-Brazilian religion and the festivity, the happiness and the way how the residents of Mangueira were living there. And at the same time, he point out, the poverty, the social needs that those people are claiming to the government. Regarding, to Mario Pedrosa project, this the project was designed by Mario in 1978 after the fire at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro. I think 90% of the collection has burned, after the fire in 1978. Um, and trying to link, Lina Bo Bardi and exhibitions, the way she looked out, the northern people and their production, and the Mario's project has both of them has a very strong sense of avant-garde, no doubt about that. But at that time, few people talking about a museum that had a collection dedicated to constructive art, you know, children's art, and how can I say, art of the insane? It's right, Michael. Art of
Uh, well,
it's pretty hard
he
to
was.
translate to English, né? Arte dos loucos.
Uh,
Uh,
yeah, I guess that would be the term at the time. Yeah.
yeah. So dedicated to construct art of insane, the children's art, and as well as the indigenous art in the late 70s. So it's a very avant-garde idea about a museum in Brazil. But I think, but regardless of that, it was a crucial way to think about what art in education mean nowadays. I think the idea concept by Mario has a strong link to think how art and education may be can read as unique project. Pedrosa at that time was already a one about the festive art, which transformed the artwork into a commodity. I think one of his concerns was about that, how the artwork has had transformed into a commodity, and I'm talking about late 90 and late 70s in Brazil. And I think the Museum of the Regions uh, was a response to this issue, but it's a guess by me.
So, so I don't hold the mic, so to speak, too long. I'm going to ask you a last question, um, which is, I think it was around 2000, around the time that Oiticica had the big body of color show at Tate and the Oiticica in London show, which is around 2007. It might have been a little bit before or after. I'm not sure. I think it was around that time
Mhm,
that Oiticica, the Tate acquired several works of Oiticica, including Tropicalia, which
mhm,
was a kind of a major acquisition, I guess. It was a kind of, I think there are five different versions of Tropicalia, and they acquired one of them. Um, Given that Oiticica had that show in '69, do you think Tropicalia, as this kind of statement acquisition, does justice to Oiticica? Or would there be a better choice of work for a museum such as Tate?
mm. Um,
And I'm asking this given your past, which I forgot to mention in the introduction,
mhm.
as the curator for the Leisure Clark, former curator of the Leisure Clark
State.
estate. So it's a kind of having had that role in the past.
Mhm,
It's almost a kind of a parallel to the Oiticica estate, I guess.
mhm.
Uh, so I kind of allow myself to ask that question to you.
Right. No worries about that. I think your question is very interesting. I think the positive aspect is the possibility for a lot of people, for many people, to get to know Hélio Oiticica's work, and no doubt about that. But the problems are bigger than the that benefit. I think it's not so much related to Oiticica, but to the fact that exhibiting exhibiting works of an experimental nature in museums is always a difficult situation to resolve. I think Tropicalia is addressed to a specific moment in Brazilian culture. It was one of the most prolific moments in Brazilian culture. I'm talking about late 60s, early 70s. I'm
Can I
talking about
interrupt you here? Because it might be confusing for if you don't know. the installation Tropicalia gave name to a musical movement that had had repercussions in cinema and theater and all sorts. So you're talking about the wider kind of cultural repercussion of the name Tropicalia, which came from that installation. Yeah.
Um, so I got lost.
Sorry, I cut you. So you were saying that it was a very important movement in the
So yeah,
60s.
yeah, 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 yeah. So it was one of the most prolific moments in Brazilian culture. I think, despite the repression of the dictatorship, you know. So I think Tropicalia has a kind of libertarian and magical character that's the museum rotate or whatever in prisms. So I don't know, Michael, because as I said, it's pretty hard to think how experimental objects, experimental installation can be seen, boy,
Oh dear. I'm sorry, everyone. He's frozen again.
the
You just froze, Felipe.
uh,
You just froze again.
wow, 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 wow. I was saying, um, I don't know if you heard my last sentence, my last phrase, but I said, Tropicalia has libertarian
Yeah. Oh, obviously the Teams isn't being very libertarian with us today.
to solve this issue because Tropicalia has a experimental and unique experience, a way to be seen by audience. So it's pretty hard to the museum showed up, this kind of installation. So I don't know if I have an answer to your question. I agree, the way Tropical was showed in Hélio's
Retrospective.
retrospective, and later, because I saw the installation 2 or 3 years ago. It's very problematic, but what can I do to solve this issue? Not the museum, the museum cannot buy the artwork. How the museum can show the installation? I think uh, a way to this kind of issue is showing the exhibition, and alongside to a seminar, or inviting scholars, curators, to speak out about the work, because it's a complete nonsense when he showed up the Tropicalia, and you don't have any context about not only the artwork in itself, but about the Brazilian culture in late 60s.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, Tate did invite curators and art critics
Mhm.
to comment on Oiticica, and
What happened?
the Brazilians just fought amongst themselves. It was very embarrassing. But anyway, on that note, I'm going to open up for any questions. I don't
Okay.
see anyone on the chat, but um,
Well, we talk a lot, huh?
could carry on. I don't see anyone, but I will. We'll continue talking. But if
Okay.
anyone wants to lift a virtual hand, there's a little
All right.
button at the top. So feel free to intervene um, and interfere. I had another question for you,
Mm-hmm.
um, which I thought I would skip because I didn't want to take over
Mm-hmm.
time, and I've just seen that I haven't. message.
Sorry.
Okay, there is there is a question from Kriton. He has his hand up. You need to unmute, Kriton.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, Kriton.
Hi, Felipe.
Hi.
Michael, I can't resist to ask this. In the context of the Brazilian avant-garde, I include Tropicalia as well. Based on the concept of anthropophagy, what is the position of the African culture? Is it ultimately the white Europeans who eat the other cultures or not?
Sorry, could you
Relate this
repeat?
to the
Kriton, there's a little bit of echo, and I
Yeah,
missed your
I didn't
last.
understand very well. Sorry.
Sorry.
That's better.
My question is that in the context of the Brazilian avant-garde, I include Tropicalia on this because it's based on this concept of anthropophagy. I'm asking, what is the position of African culture? Finally, is the white European that eats all the other cultures or not? Because, I relate this also to this concept of representation of Black African culture in Brazil. And I remember a few years ago, was, you remember when we went to Brazilian embassy and there was Guy Bread there as well. It was an event. And I remember I asked on this event something related to Black culture, African culture in Brazil, and was silence, nothing. Was like, who are they?
Exactly. Yeah.
What is African culture in Brazil?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a good
Philip,
question.
do you want to answer that, Felipe?
You can answer, Michael, because he asked about, Tropicalia and anthropophagy. That's your issue. That's your department. But
Really?
the second part of the question, the second question, in fact, I don't know. There is if force on the last 5 years, particularly came from MASP to discover or to show up, the Brazilian connection with the African arts, especially the exhibition. I didn't see the exhibition. Well, but the exhibition involving, Rubem Valentim. Rubem Valentim was he was he was Brazilian, and he was born in Salvador, I think, and he was born in the state of Bahia for sure. And it's a very interesting work because he connect, the constructive art. He worked. I think he started to work in late 50s or mid 50s or something like that, and he connect, constructed art to Afro-Brazilian religions. So it's a very interesting work, and I think I didn't see the exhibition either. I bought the catalog, but I heard some comments about the exhibition and the catalog, and I think it was a marvelous work made by MASP regarding the Rubem Valentim's research. But it's pretty hard to make another example, regarding what you asked me, where is the African art in Brazil? Um, I think there is a connection with what I said, during my talk. The way how the bourgeois scholars, curators see no European art. All of them is relegate to artisan field. So it's confusion way to criticize what's art and what art should be.
Yeah, I think that we should. I mean, Rubens Valentim is a good example, but I think we shouldn't forget or we need to remember that a lot of high culture in Brazil, especially in literature, was produced by Afro descendants, and that's even though that within the history books that their kind of portraits have been kind of whitened to look more kind of European looking. Machado de Assis and many others. But in terms of anthropophagy, we have to talk about it in different historical points. At its inception, it is very much a product of the Parisian kind of negrophilia fashion of the 1920s. Oswald de Andrade and Tarsila do Amaral were kind of constructed that idea from Parisian fashions for kind of exoticizing and the kind of the black body, etc., the Josephine Baker, etc., images and so on. So I think at its origin, anthropophagy is more a European concept that then is applied to a Brazil that the artists and intellectuals hardly knew or hardly had experience, that they kind of that they represented in their own kind of terms. With Oiticica, there is a more in the 1960s. There is a kind of a more direct and genuine, I guess, desire to engage, but there's still a representation. There is still a lack of agency in terms of that representation. When the art itself is considered as participatory. Within that participation, there is a clear distinction or a hierarchy between the artist and the participant. I think that's clear. So, I mean, we need to look at it the way it is. I don't know if that answers your question, but I did see another hand raised, and I think it was Paula Terra, but I'm not so sure. But if you want to come in.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's a bit loud, but yes, we can hear you.
All right, okay. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Paula.
Hi, Philip. Yeah, I think it's very valid, your point. I just think that you could dive a little bit more your research in terms of the understanding of culture. What is culture, how culture is seen in the end of 50s and 60s. A few things that I might suggest is, I mean, Ferreira Goulart was a Marxist, and so was Pedrosa. I mean, a bit more Trotskyist, isn't it? But there is a very strong political side to it that when brings about the issue of equality and social function of the arts. So I don't think none of these people you're talking about were naive or unaware of these issues. I mean, as Michael was saying about Pedrosa, Pedrosa during the 20s was caught up in Germany when he was trying to go to Switzerland to study during the war. And he then got acquainted with the study of Prinzhorn. There was a study in the art of the insane. And that was very important for him later on, because also he became acquainted with the expressionist artists at the time, including Paul Klee, that has become very, very important to him. And Klee had a very strong point about primitivism, the study of primitivism in art. I mean, the bow rider is something to do with that as well. So Pedrosa in 1963, for instance, make a huge point, 63 or what, in the Biennale, that he brings Klee in contrast, Klee and Calder against, other, because his understanding was they were all, at least, I don't know about Lina particularly, but obviously I got my thesis, MA, PhD, and everything about Hélio, but and Pedrosa was very important in my studies. I mean, there was a very strong point of criticizing the westernized vision of subject, object, all that, and the criticism as well, the way the museums westernized culture, which was this. So the idea we're now discussing on decolonialism was already there, present, in their questions and research. You did mention these three, obviously, two leaders and Hélio. They were the closest ones to Pedrosa at the time. And they really tried to find in the popular culture, it wasn't just a romanticization of the world of the favela, obviously must have some, but I think there was in there a very strong point about the vital forces of the revolt, of the political point, what you can find in the popular classes, that you can't find in the middle classes. And I think it is something that I don't know how this resonates with Lina, but with Hélio, I've kind of, I've discussed those things in the thesis, not the point to discuss it here, but I think there is counterculture movement, there is the moving cinema movement that I think you have to take that into account as well. There's Pasolini, there's Godard, particularly Ligia Pape was very much into that. And so the role of popular culture, it's a very, very important thing to think about. And there were philosophical issues as well, like for Hélio, for instance, the reading of Nietzsche, ethics rather than aesthetics and things like that. So there was a philosophy of life that subsidized his work that I think is quite important, So I mean, we could think that it was naive the way they've approached popular culture subjects, but I don't think it was. I think there was much more to that. There is also in Rio, there was a school of philosophical thinking that was called the Institute ISEB, ISEB, that was intellectuals discussing sociology, anthropology, philosophy at the time, and thinking society, because how this modernist project, because when the military took over, it has become very clear as well that the modernist project that they've embraced of rationalism and all that, it's not something that the intellectuals were agreeing with, So they made a point in this countercultural movement as well to explore all the possibilities of representing culture. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of things more that can be researched.
Hi, Paula. Thank you so much for your words. I think you talk about the second edition of the Bienal de São Paulo, or São Paulo Bienal, or
Yeah, it was
1953.
1953, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
there was a huge retrospective of Harry Moore as well, I think. I forgot about that. Thank you so much for your kind information. And I'm starting to study on CPC movement as well. So
Yeah, exactly.
it was nice to hear you say about the ZEB, the intellectuals from ZEB. There is a strong connection, between CPC and ZEB.
I found several books at Oiticica's library from the Zebi group. He used to pop in Botafogo and attend some of the meetings. I was very, very surprised because when I was doing my thesis, master thesis at PUC in end of the 80s, I spent 3 months at the Oiticica's project because they've also invited me to do his bibliography. So I had the chance to go through his books and his marked books with his notes, So he was into this philosophical thinking of the meaning of culture, and the anthropological, the philosophical, was a bit more than just simply, oh, how beautiful favela, the dances. It's not just that.
Yeah, I think when we talk about Sika, we have to talk about a progression in his work, but also in his way of thinking. And I think we can't just talk about his relation to the favela because it's a changing relation. It begins in 64, but by 60, 67, 68, before he comes to London, it's already changed and become far more complex, particularly with the kind of friendships that he made with Cara de Cavallo, for example, and the kind of very ambivalent positionings that he himself held. I mean, speaking to Wally Salomon, for example, he had a very ambivalent position within the favela, being kind of an outsider and also not quite an insider, but very close to certain people, but not everyone. So I think that between Tropicalia in 67, when he shows it for the first time, and the exhibition in London in 69, there is a significant shift in his way of thinking, which kind of materializes itself in the Whitechapel project, and in particular in the Eden installation or environment. I think Eden is a kind of translation of Tropicalia, a kind of a filtering those kind of potentially exoticizing images. And my question to Felipe about the the acquisition of Tropicalia by Tate is kind of was loaded in this sense, in that why did they choose Tropicalia rather than Eden, which was a project constructed or conceived for London, and it would make more sense. I mean, the Americans are very good at this. They kind of they've almost adopted Oiticica as an American artist because he lived there for 7 years in New York during the 70s. So it's so they've I've seen, I can't remember where, but I've seen statements saying that Brazilian and based in New York artists kind of thing. So they're very kind of, as Paulo Sérgio Duarte said, the Americans are the most anthropophagite kind of. Jackson Pollock was the most anthropophagite artist. So yeah, so Oiticica's relation to Mangueira changes over time between 64 to 69, and also when he returns from New York in I think it was 77. He is kind of shocked and not only by how the whole thing has changed, the environment, but also how many of his friends have been killed as well, or disappeared, etc. So it depends on the moment in which which we're talking about. So shall I go back to I can't remember what my question was. Yeah,
did you ask it? Did you ask anything?
No, I didn't, because I just wanted to pick up on something that Paula said again, that the Pedrosa's biennial, which was 63, when there was the Paul Klee.
53, acho que 50.
63.
60,
Yeah, 63. The 53 was the big Guernica biennial, but Pedrosa, I don't think that was Gomes Machado who was involved in that, or Sergio Millier. I can't remember.
I don't know.
But the one that Paula is referring to is the 1963 with the big exhibition of Paul Klee.
Yeah, Pedrosa was in the board of the directors. He wasn't, the main person, but he was always connected, and he traveled abroad to try and convince the German government and etc. to send a huge exhibition of clay, because I think, in a way, Pedrosa's vision of the modern project has. And Calder, there were two, for him, the main artists in his conception, which was not only about the arts, what you're doing, but it's the way they also work, the vision, the human vision, of arts as a tool for change, So there is some very strong expressionist aspect, and the whole project of the New Concrete was based on the idea of the return of the expression, isn't it? So anyway, yeah. So just things that we can.
But I wanted to pick on that because it's a good example of a kind of entirely different reading of 20th century art history. We've become kind of overly informed by this idea of the transition from Paris to New York after the war, and the importance of abstract expressionism, even as kind of reaction and leading to the movements of minimalism, conceptual art, and pop, which this has kind of become the standards, the canon, basically, and the way in which contemporary art is understood. And I think if we're talking about decolonizing, we have to start by questioning this kind of overbearing narrative. And we can start questioning this by remembering examples such as Mari Pedrosa and the way in which he understood a particular development of art, how Herbert Reed understood a particular development, how even more recently Guy Brett, through this idea of the kinetic and this, how he brought kind of the constructivist avant-gardes with the art informel into this kind of common kind of into these kind of common ideas of field forces, for example. So there are many multiple ways of reading the development of art, which none of them are kind of the kind of take predominance over another, other than the predominance of the social, economic, geopolitical power of who's actually kind of speaking them. So, yeah. So I think that,
for instance, looking, the contributions the biennial gave to the artists in Brazilian scene since the, early 50s. It's a way to decolonize the gazing on Brazilian art, and it's nice to hear that.
yeah. And on that note, I think if anyone has any other questions, please speak now or
or I
or be
have to,
frustrated
or I have to
for
dinner. Sorry about that.
but yeah, because I realized that we have until 8 o'clock, but we very rarely take it that long, simply because it's a long time to be in front of a screen, especially. Usually when we have in-person lectures, we all tend to kind of
Yeah.
have a more informal gathering from 7:30. So if we don't have any more questions, I think I will thank Felipe very much for today's presentation, and thank Paula, Creton, and for questions, and Maribel and Evelina and Gabrielle for the support and reassurance about tonight.
Thank you so much, Michael, for the invitation and the questions for everyone. And hope to see you soon. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, and I hope to see you in person at some stage before you go back.
I hope so.
Okay, thanks everyone.